Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, untamed wilderness, the air crisp with the scent of pine and the distant murmur of a hidden river. This is Yellowstone, a place of breathtaking beauty and immense power, a landscape that has witnessed the ebb and flow of centuries, holding within its rugged embrace countless stories. But some stories are etched not in the geological record, but in the hushed whispers of memory, in the lingering questions that haunt the edges of human experience. In the summer of 1992, Yellowstone became the silent stage for one such story, a tragedy that for decades seemed destined to fade into the annals of unsolved mysteries. 6 siblings, full of life and the shared joy of a family camping trip, disappeared. Not a trace, not a clue, just an echoing void where laughter and companionship once resided. The initial search was extensive, a frantic sweep across miles of rugged terrain, fueled by a desperate hope that quickly turned to despair. The park's immense scale, its dense forests, its labyrinthine canyons, and its volatile geothermal features all conspired to swallow any hint of their presence. It was as if the very earth had opened up and claimed them, a chilling thought that resonated with the primal fear of nature's indifference. For 32 years, the silence of their disappearance persisted, a heavy blanket of unanswered questions that settled over the families and the communities connected to them. The case grew cold, a painful footnote in the park's history, a stark reminder of the vulnerability of human beings in the face of the wild. We often think of national parks as sanctuaries, havens of peace and natural wonder. Yellowstone, in particular, embodies this ideal with its iconic geysers, its majestic wildlife, and its unparalleled vistas. Yet beneath this idyllic surface lies a raw, untamed power, a force that commands respect and at times instills a profound sense of awe mixed with trepidation. It's a place where the natural world operates on its own terms, indifferent to human desires or tragedies. This inherent wildness, while a draw for millions, also presents an environment where the smallest of human traces can be easily erased, where the passage of time can act as a potent eraser of evidence. The siblings' vanishing act was not a sudden, dramatic event witnessed by many, but a slow, insidious disappearance, a gradual fading into the vastness that made the lack of any definitive clue all the more perplexing and, frankly, terrifying. The absence of a struggle, the lack of any sign of foul play, the complete void of communication. These elements painted a picture of an event so inexplicable that it bordered on the supernatural for those grappling with its reality. It was a mystery that defied conventional explanation, a puzzle with too many missing pieces, leaving behind only a gnawing sense of unease and a profound sadness. The narrative of this disappearance, however, was about to be dramatically rewritten, not by a sudden breakthrough in forensic science or a dramatic confession, but by a discovery that seemed to mock the very passage of time. A discovery that, after 32 years of silence, would force the park and the world to confront this enduring enigma once more. This is not just a story about a missing family. It is a testament to the enduring power of hope, the relentless pursuit of truth, and the profound mysteries that nature can hold. It's about how even in the face of overwhelming silence, the faintest echo of a family's plea can resonate for decades, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The story of the vanished siblings is a stark reminder that some of the most profound human dramas unfold not in crowded cities or on well-trodden paths, but in the quiet, majestic, and sometimes unforgiving heart of the wild. It's a narrative that beckons us to look closer, to question what we see, and to remember that even in the most remote corners of our world, human stories, however tragic, leave an indelible mark, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The discovery of the siblings' tent, 32 years after their disappearance, wasn't merely the unearthing of an object. It was an archaeological revelation of sorts, a tangible whisper from the past that defied the relentless erosion of time and weather. For decades, the prevailing assumption had been that the elements, coupled with the park's dynamic geological processes, shifting earth, flash floods, the slow creep of vegetation, would have long since reduced any trace of human presence to dust and memory. The tent's improbable preservation, however, suggested a very different narrative. Picture this: a canvas structure, its fabric likely faded and weathered, its poles perhaps slightly corroded, yet fundamentally intact, standing upright as if its occupants had merely stepped away for a moment. This level of preservation in the harsh Yellowstone environment, especially over 3 decades, points to a highly unusual set of circumstances. Perhaps the tent was situated in a microclimate offering exceptional protection, a sheltered ravine or a dense thicket that shielded it from the harshest winds and deepest snows. Alternatively, the ground itself might have played a role. A rapid freeze, for instance, could have effectively encased the tent and its immediate surroundings, creating a time capsule until thaw. Investigators would immediately be drawn to the tent's orientation. Was it pitched conventionally, indicating an intended campsite, or was it haphazardly erected, suggesting an emergency stop? The condition of the ground around the tent would be equally critical. Were there any signs of disturbance, footprints, scattered belongings, evidence of a struggle? The absence of such indicators, if indeed they were absent, would deepen the mystery, steering the investigation away from conventional explanations like animal encounters or accidental falls. Consider the psychological impact of such a find. For the families of the missing siblings, it would be a jolt, a sudden reawakening of raw grief, and a renewed, albeit agonizing, hope. For the investigators, it presents a confounding paradox. Evidence that has survived the unimaginable, yet offers no immediate answers. This discovery fundamentally shifts the investigation from a missing persons case to a potential crime scene, albeit one frozen in time. It compels a meticulous re-examination of every detail, every witness statement, every theory that had been previously discarded. It's akin to finding a key that doesn't fit any lock, but you're certain it unlocks something important. The implications of this preservation are vast. It suggests that the siblings' final moments, or at least the moments leading up to their disappearance from the immediate vicinity of the tent, might be more accessible than previously believed. The tent itself becomes a focal point, a silent witness whose very presence demands to be understood. Now think about how this scientific anomaly, this improbable survival, forces us to reconsider the power of nature. While Yellowstone is known for its geological dynamism, this event highlights how localized conditions can also create pockets of stasis, preserving remnants of human activity against all odds. It's a fascinating interplay between the park's grand, sweeping forces and the subtle protective elements that can exist within its vastness. The integrity of the tent, standing against the passage of time, serves as a stark metaphor for the enduring nature of unanswered questions. The discovery of the siblings' remarkably preserved tent in 1992, a full 32 years after their disappearance, immediately shifted the investigation's focus from a presumed wilderness mishap to something far more unsettling, a potential scenario deliberately obscured. This preservation implies an unlikely confluence of environmental factors that shielded the structure from the typical ravages of time and weather in Yellowstone. Imagine a small depression in the earth, perhaps a natural hollow or a shallow gully, which over the decades became a sanctuary for the tent. This protected microenvironment would have significantly reduced exposure to the relentless scouring of wind-driven snow, the abrasive action of ice, and the gradual decomposition aided by sunlight and moisture. Furthermore, the specific composition of the soil in that localized area might have contributed, perhaps being unusually dense or containing mineral properties that inhibited organic breakdown. Consider the possibility of a swift, deep freeze occurring shortly after the siblings vanished. If the ground froze solid around the tent's footprint, effectively encasing it in ice, this would have acted as a natural preservative, halting decomposition and preventing the structure from being easily dislodged or buried by subsequent snowfalls. This kind of localized stasis, where a small parcel of land seems to resist the broader environmental forces at play, is not unheard of in wilderness settings, though its occurrence over such a long period is certainly exceptional. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where the expected outcome of time and nature seems to be defied. It forces a re-evaluation of initial assumptions. Instead of assuming the tent was simply lost to the elements, investigators had to grapple with the possibility that its pristine condition was, in itself, a clue, suggesting a deliberate, albeit unknown, effort to conceal it, or, at the very least, an unusual sequence of events that prevented its natural decay. The tent's very existence, so incongruous with the passage of 3 decades, prompts questions about the environment surrounding it. Was the area prone to flash floods that might have deposited sediment, creating a protective layer, or perhaps a landslide, quickly burying the tent and then stabilizing, thereby limiting further exposure? These scenarios, while dramatic, offer plausible explanations for an object's survival against the odds. The scientific implications are profound. It's a case study in how localized ecological niches can preserve artifacts in ways that defy broader climatic trends. The preservation isn't just about the tent surviving. It's about what that survival tells us about the immediate surroundings and the events that may have transpired there. This improbable survival compels us to think about the hidden pockets of stillness within even the most dynamic landscapes, places where time seems to move at a different pace. The discovery of the tent, an anomaly defying the expected decay of 32 years, compels a deeper dive into the improbability of its survival. While the previous section explored potential environmental factors, this segment must focus on the statistical unlikelihood and the implications for investigation arising from such a preservation. Consider the sheer number of variables that must align for a fabric structure to endure Yellowstone's harsh climate for over 3 decades. Prevailing winds which can exceed 60 miles per hour would typically tear such a structure apart. Deep snow loads, accumulating to many feet, would crush it. The freeze-thaw cycles, common in Yellowstone's high-altitude environment, would cause material fatigue and degradation. Furthermore, the park's abundant wildlife, from elk and bison to smaller mammals, would likely scavenge or disturb any abandoned campsite. The fact that the tent remained intact and seemingly in its original position suggests a scenario where these destructive forces were, for an extended period, remarkably absent or significantly mitigated in that specific locale. This isn't merely an interesting environmental quirk. For investigators, it's a statistical anomaly that demands a radical re-evaluation of the initial assumptions about the disappearance. If the tent survived so effectively, it implies that the area was either exceptionally undisturbed or that the event itself led to a rapid, almost instantaneous stabilization that protected the site. Now think about how this applies when you face a seemingly impossible piece of evidence. It forces the investigative team to consider scenarios that might have previously been dismissed as too far-fetched. The statistical improbability elevates the tent from a mere relic to a piece of evidence that actively challenges the established narrative of a simple wilderness accident. It suggests that whatever happened was not a chaotic, destructive event that scattered belongings and tore apart shelters, but something that perhaps led to a peculiar form of preservation. Consequently, the focus shifts. Instead of searching for scattered remains or evidence of a struggle across a wide area, investigators must meticulously examine the immediate vicinity of the tent. hypothesizing that the key events unfolded precisely where the tent stood, undisturbed by the passage of time. This preservation, therefore, acts as a powerful directional indicator, narrowing the scope of inquiry in a way that sheer absence of evidence never could. It's like finding a perfectly preserved footprint in a vast, eroded landscape. The footprint tells you not just that someone was there, but precisely where they stepped, and that the surrounding conditions were unusual enough to leave such a distinct mark. Building on this, however, the statistical unlikelihood also raises questions about the intentionality of the tent's preservation. Could it have been deliberately placed or secured in such a way that it would endure? While seemingly a grim prospect, investigators must entertain the possibility that the tent's intact state is not an accident of nature, but a consequence of human action. Either an attempt to stage a scene or a desperate, perhaps misguided effort by the siblings themselves to secure their shelter in an unforeseen yet non-destructive situation. This starkly contrasts with the typical narrative of lost campers, where scattered gear and signs of struggle are the grim indicators. The tent's survival, in its very improbability, forces a more complex and potentially darker interpretation of events. The uncanny preservation of the siblings' tent doesn't just defy the typical erosion of time, it actively points to a highly unusual sequence of events that likely occurred at the campsite. Instead of a gradual deterioration or a chaotic scattering, the tent's intact state suggests a rapid, perhaps even immediate, sealing off of the site. Consider a scenario where the siblings, encountering an unforeseen and overwhelming threat, not necessarily violent but perhaps environmental or geological, reacted with extreme urgency. This could involve a sudden localized seismic event, like a micro-tremor that caused the tent to collapse inwards, or a rapid influx of water from an underground spring that then quickly receded, leaving the tent partially submerged and then encased by settling sediment. Alternatively, think of an intensely localized atmospheric phenomenon, a sudden downdraft or a micro-burst of wind that, rather than tearing the tent apart, pressed it down onto the ground with immense force, anchoring it. This kind of rapid, forceful stabilization would have protected the fabric from tearing and prevented lighter debris from being scattered by subsequent breezes. Now, consider how this applies when you're faced with evidence that seems to contradict the expected natural processes. Such a scenario forces investigators to look for evidence of sudden environmental shifts in the immediate vicinity, rather than broad signs of decay across a wider area. They'd be searching for unusual soil compaction patterns, localized deposits of sediment that don't match the surrounding terrain's geological history, or evidence of rapid water flow and drainage. The tent, in this context, isn't just a survivor. It's a marker indicating a specific spot where time, for a crucial period, seemed to stand still. This implies that the siblings' disappearance was not a prolonged struggle or a slow succumbing to the elements, but rather a swift, decisive event that occurred at that precise location. This distinct sequence of events, so different from the typical narrative of lost hikers, compels a re-evaluation of every theory, pushing aside explanations that involve gradual exposure or prolonged wandering. It's like finding a perfectly preserved fossil in a geological layer that shouldn't contain it. The anomaly itself becomes the most crucial piece of evidence, pointing to an extraordinary localized history. Furthermore, the tent's improbable survival opens up a fascinating avenue concerning the psychological state and potential actions of the siblings themselves. If they were indeed the ones who, in some way, ensured the tent's preservation, it suggests a level of foresight or a desperate attempt at self-preservation that goes beyond simple panic. Imagine them realizing they were in an extremely precarious situation, perhaps one that required them to remain stationary and concealed. Their actions might have been driven by a sudden, overwhelming understanding of an immediate danger that necessitated absolute stillness and minimal disturbance. This could involve a situation where they perceived an imminent yet non-destructive threat, perhaps a rare and aggressive animal encounter that they believed could be weathered by remaining hidden and silent, or a sudden localized geological instability, like a fissure opening nearby, that made movement perilous. In such a scenario, their priority would shift from escape to immediate passive defense. Now consider how this applies when you're trying to understand human behavior under extreme duress. Their actions might have involved deliberately collapsing the tent inward, securing it with whatever they had at hand, or even using their own bodies to weigh it down, creating a makeshift low-profile shelter. This would explain why the tent remained largely intact and in situ, as opposed to being blown away or dismantled. It's a stark contrast to the usual assumption of panicked flight or a struggle that would lead to scattered belongings. This interpretation shifts the focus from external forces of nature to the internal human response to an extraordinary threat. The tent, therefore, becomes a testament to their possible collective decision-making, a silent monument to their strategy for survival, however ultimately tragic their fate. This psychological layer, driven by the physical evidence of preservation, suggests a more complex and coordinated response from the siblings than previously imagined, transforming the mystery from one of simple loss to one of potentially deliberate, albeit desperate, actions taken in the face of an overwhelming, yet perhaps non-violent crisis. The tent, in this light, isn't merely an object that survived. It's a symbol of their final unified effort to endure. The discovery of the tent, in its almost defiant state of preservation after so many years, compels a rigorous examination of its immediate surroundings. It's not enough to simply acknowledge its survival. Investigators must now delve into the minute details of the terrain directly adjacent to it, searching for subtle indicators that might have been overlooked in the initial broader searches. Now consider how this applies when you face a situation where a single artifact suggests a highly localized event. This means scrutinizing the soil composition for unusual mineral deposits or evidence of rapid sedimentation that doesn't align with the park's known geological history. Were there any signs of a sudden, localized inundation, perhaps from an underground spring or a temporary flash flood event that quickly receded, leaving the tent protected by a thin layer of silt? Conversely, was the ground unusually compacted in a way that suggests an immense downward force rather than the chaotic impact of wind or debris? These microscopic geological clues, invisible to the casual observer but critical to forensic analysis, could provide the context for the tent's improbable endurance. The absence of widespread disturbance around the tent is as significant as its presence. If there were no signs of a struggle, no scattered personal effects beyond the immediate vicinity, and no evidence of animal activity that would have dismantled or moved the structure, it strongly suggests that the siblings' disappearance was not a protracted ordeal of wandering or a violent encounter that would have left a trail of disarray. Instead, it points towards a swift, contained incident that occurred precisely at that location, effectively freezing that small area in time. Furthermore, this meticulously preserved campsite offers a unique opportunity to reconstruct the siblings' final known moments through the lens of their immediate actions and decisions. The way the tent was pitched, its orientation relative to prevailing weather patterns, and the arrangement of any discovered internal contents could reveal their preparedness and perceived threats. Now consider how this applies when you're trying to infer behavior from inanimate evidence. If the tent was collapsed inward rather than torn by wind, it might indicate an intentional act of seeking shelter from an overhead threat, or perhaps a rapid, coordinated effort to make themselves less visible. The lack of any external damage suggests that whatever transpired did not involve external forces actively trying to breach their shelter. This points away from scenarios involving aggressive wildlife or external human conflict, and more towards an event that compelled them to remain utterly still and concealed. It's akin to finding a meticulously built dam in a dry riverbed. The structure itself speaks to a deliberate attempt to control or divert something, rather than a passive response to its absence. The integrity of the tent, therefore, becomes a silent narrator of their final strategy, a testament to a unified decision to endure rather than flee, suggesting a perceived danger that was either immediate, overwhelming, and localized, or a situation that demanded absolute stillness. This perspective transforms the tent from a mere piece of lost equipment into a profound artifact of human agency under extreme and still mysterious duress. It's a subtle but crucial shift in understanding, moving from a passive victimhood to an active, albeit ultimately tragic, response. The very integrity of the tent, standing as a weathered sentinel, suggests that any potential threat encountered by the siblings was not one of overt destruction, but rather of insidious environmental alteration. This could involve a rapid shift in atmospheric pressure, a localized gas release from the Yellowstone caldera, or even a sudden, intense magnetic anomaly. Now consider how this applies when you encounter evidence that points to environmental factors far beyond typical weather patterns. Such occurrences, while rare, are within the realm of possibility in a geologically active region like Yellowstone. A sudden, localized release of odorless, colorless gases, such as carbon dioxide or hydrogen sulfide, could have incapacitated the occupants without leaving visible signs of struggle or property damage. The tent, by remaining sealed, would have trapped these gases, potentially leading to a swift, silent incapacitation of anyone inside. The subsequent natural processes of the park, such as wind and precipitation, might have then dissipated these gases over time, leaving the tent relatively undisturbed, a tomb that preserved the scene without overtly displaying violence. This hypothesis hinges on the absence of external damage and the unlikely preservation of the structure itself, implying that the danger was internal or atmospheric, rather than physical. Furthermore, the tent's preservation might hint at an unusual interaction with the park's unique geothermal features. Imagine a scenario where the campsite was situated near a previously undiscovered or temporarily active thermal vent or fumarole. A sudden, albeit brief, emission of superheated steam or a plume of volcanic ash could have forced the siblings to seek immediate sealed shelter within the tent, collapsing it or securing it tightly to prevent inhalation or scalding. The subsequent cooling and natural processes of the park could then have stabilized the environment, leaving the tent remarkably intact. Now consider how this applies when you're trying to explain an anomaly through the specific geological context of a location. This would explain why the tent remained upright or collapsed inward rather than being blown away. The primary force was not wind, but a need for immediate, enclosed protection from a localized, intense environmental event. The lack of widespread debris would also be consistent with a contained phenomenon that affected the immediate campsite rather than the broader surrounding area. This interpretation shifts the focus from a simple disappearance to a potential, albeit rare, geological hazard that dictated the siblings' final actions and the subsequent preservation of their campsite. The tent, in this context, becomes a silent witness to an extraordinary environmental event, an artifact that survived because it was a refuge from a danger that was as potent as it was ephemeral. Another crucial layer to consider is the possibility of a highly localized and unusual ecological interaction. Yellowstone is home to a diverse array of fauna, and while animal attacks are a common concern, this scenario might involve a subtler, yet equally impactful interaction. Imagine a situation where the siblings inadvertently stumbled upon a nesting ground of a particularly territorial and aggressive species, or perhaps disturbed a rare, venomous insect swarm. Their immediate reaction would be to seek immediate enclosed sanctuary. Now consider how this applies when you're trying to account for a sudden, decisive disappearance that leaves minimal external trace. The tent, if rapidly and securely deployed, could have provided a temporary barrier against such a threat, allowing the siblings to wait for the danger to pass. The fact that they never emerged suggests that the threat, whatever its nature, was either prolonged, overwhelming, or that their attempt at containment ultimately failed in a way that didn't involve overt destruction of their shelter. The tent's survival would then be explained by their desperate, unified effort to create an impenetrable barrier, a testament to their collective will to survive against a highly specific and localized danger. This perspective emphasizes the unknown biological or entomological hazards that might exist within such a vast and wild ecosystem, capable of precipitating rapid and decisive actions from unsuspecting visitors. The discovery of the tent, remarkably intact after 32 years, forces a profound re-evaluation of the duration and nature of the siblings' potential confinement. If their disappearance was not a swift incapacitation, but a prolonged period of being sheltered within the tent, the implications shift dramatically. Now consider how this applies when you're exploring scenarios of extended survival in an isolated environment. The tent in this context becomes less a tomb and more a temporary refuge. This suggests that the initial threat, whatever it was, might have been perceived as transient, prompting the siblings to remain stationary and wait it out. However, the fact that they were never subsequently found implies that the waiting period extended beyond their capacity to survive, or that the threat evolved in a way that prevented their eventual emergence. The environmental conditions within the tent over such a prolonged period would have been critical, even with minimal external disturbance. Factors like dwindling supplies, the accumulation of waste, and the psychological toll of extreme confinement would have become increasingly significant. Furthermore, the tent's preservation might offer clues about the siblings' resourcefulness and their ability to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. If they managed to secure their shelter and remain within it for an extended duration, it suggests a level of collective decision-making and a shared understanding of their predicament. This implies that they likely had some basic provisions, such as food and water, which would have been consumed over time. The absence of any significant external scavenging or disarray around the tent could indicate that their confinement was so complete that even opportunistic wildlife was deterred or unable to access the site. Now, consider how this applies when you're trying to infer past actions from limited evidence. The internal state of the tent, if any artifacts were found within, would be paramount. Were there signs of rationing, attempts to create alternative water sources, or any efforts to signal for help that were ultimately unsuccessful? The very fact that the tent remained a cohesive unit, rather than being dismantled for materials or abandoned in a desperate attempt to escape, speaks volumes about their strategy, however tragically it played out. It suggests a belief, however faint, that remaining within their established shelter offered the best chance of survival or eventual rescue. Another crucial layer to consider is the potential for a deliberate act of concealment, either by the siblings themselves or by an unknown third party, to explain the tent's improbable preservation. If the siblings, for reasons yet unknown, chose to make it appear as though they had simply vanished, their actions might have included meticulously securing their shelter to prevent its natural degradation. This could have involved burying it partially, anchoring it with heavy objects, or even constructing a makeshift barrier around it. Now, consider how this applies when you encounter evidence that seems too perfect, too preserved, to be accidental. This hypothesis introduces a layer of human agency into the preservation narrative. It suggests that the tent's intact state might not be solely a product of environmental factors, but a deliberate consequence of an action taken to obscure their presence or their fate. This would imply a level of planning and foresight that is deeply unsettling, transforming the narrative from one of tragic accident to one of potentially orchestrated disappearance. The absence of any signs of struggle or external interference around the tent would be consistent with such a scenario, as any such evidence would contradict the intent of a clean, seemingly inexplicable vanishing. This perspective forces investigators to consider motives and deliberate actions that extend beyond the immediate survival needs of the lost campers. The enduring mystery of the vanished siblings, amplified by the discovery of their miraculously preserved tent, compels us to consider the subtle, often overlooked, psychological dimensions of wilderness survival and disappearance. Beyond the immediate physical threats of the environment, the human mind itself can become a complex factor in such events. Now consider how this applies when you're exploring the less tangible, yet equally potent forces that influence human behavior under extreme duress. The prolonged isolation, the gnawing uncertainty, and the sheer terror of their situation could have induced profound psychological shifts in the siblings. This might have manifested as a form of learned helplessness, where the overwhelming nature of their predicament led to a state of emotional paralysis, rendering them incapable of initiating escape or signaling for help, even if opportunities arose. Alternatively, the intense stress could have triggered acute dissociative states, where individuals become detached from their reality, their actions driven by instinct or a subconscious desire for oblivion rather than rational thought. The remarkable preservation of the tent in this psychological context could be interpreted not as a sign of deliberate concealment, but as a byproduct of the siblings' own mental withdrawal. They might have retreated into themselves, their focus narrowed to mere subsistence within the perceived safety of their shelter, effectively ceasing to engage with the external world. Furthermore, the interconnectedness of the siblings themselves adds another layer of psychological complexity. In a group survival scenario, particularly involving family members, group dynamics can either foster resilience or exacerbate distress. The shared trauma could have led to a powerful sense of collective resignation, where the despair of one member amplified that of the others, creating a feedback loop of hopelessness. Conversely, internal conflicts or a breakdown in leadership could have paralyzed their decision-making capacity. Now consider how this applies when you're analyzing a situation involving multiple individuals facing a shared crisis. If the siblings experienced a profound sense of abandonment or an overwhelming feeling that rescue was impossible, their collective psychological state might have led them to cease active attempts at survival, accepting their fate within the confines of their camp. The tent, therefore, becomes a silent witness not just to their physical presence, but to their internal psychological surrender. It's like a perfectly preserved photograph capturing a moment of profound stillness, hinting at an inner world of quiet despair rather than outward struggle. Another crucial layer to consider is the potential impact of sensory deprivation or overload on the siblings' perception of reality. Yellowstone's wilderness, while visually stunning, can also present disorienting sensory experiences. The constant hum of geothermal activity, the vast, undifferentiated expanse of the forest, and the unpredictable weather patterns could contribute to a distorted sense of time and space. Now consider how this applies when you're investigating how altered sensory input can affect human judgment. If the siblings were subjected to prolonged periods of extreme sensory input, such as the overwhelming roar of a geyser eruption or the unnerving silence of a snow-laden forest, their cognitive functions could have been severely impaired. This disorientation might have led them to misjudge their surroundings, to believe they were in a more perilous situation than they actually were, or to lose their bearings entirely. The tent's preservation could then be seen as a consequence of their seeking refuge from a perceived, but perhaps not fully understood, environmental assault. Their inability to reorient themselves or to find their way back to civilization, even if the immediate threat subsided, would explain their continued absence. The tent, in this light, represents not just a physical shelter, but a psychological anchor in a world that had become overwhelmingly confusing and threatening. Their final moments, therefore, might have been characterized not by a violent struggle, but by a quiet succumbing to disorientation and the loss of their perceived connection to the outside world. The discovery of the tent, standing as a testament to time's strange selectivity, opens a new vista, the potential for undocumented geological phenomena to have played a role. Yellowstone's subsurface is a dynamic, volatile entity, a vast network of magma chambers, hydrothermal systems, and fault lines. While visible geysers and hot springs are its most famous manifestations, the park also harbors less apparent yet equally potent geological forces. Now consider how this applies when you're investigating events in a highly geologically active region. It's plausible that an unusual, localized hydrothermal event, perhaps a sudden surge from a previously dormant vent, or a brief, intense gas emission, could have occurred directly at the campsite. Such an event might not have left widespread destruction, but could have created an environment inimical to life for a critical period, forcing the siblings into the tent for protection. Imagine a sudden, intense release of carbon dioxide from the ground. This odorless, colorless gas, heavier than air, could have pooled around the tent, incapacitating anyone inside without leaving a trace of struggle or external damage. The subsequent natural ventilation of the area, perhaps aided by wind or subsequent seismic activity, would have cleared the gas, leaving the tent and its occupants in a state of eerie preservation. This isn't the dramatic explosion of a geyser, but a more subtle, insidious geological force. Furthermore, the tent's improbable endurance might be explained by localized seismic activity that, rather than causing widespread destruction, actually stabilized the immediate surroundings. Yellowstone sits atop the Yellowstone caldera, a supervolcano, and experiences thousands of minor earthquakes annually. A very specific low-magnitude tremor, perhaps occurring at a precise angle, could have caused the tent to collapse inwards, effectively pinning it to the ground and shielding it from the elements. Conversely, a slight subsidence of the ground could have created a natural depression, further protecting the structure from wind and snow accumulation over the decades. Now consider how this applies when you're trying to understand the interaction between subtle geological forces and human artifacts. This scenario posits that the very earth beneath them, in a moment of quiet upheaval, inadvertently created a protective capsule. The lack of significant displacement of the tent or its contents would be consistent with such a controlled, localized geological event. The preservation, therefore, is not merely an absence of destructive forces, but a consequence of a specific, stabilizing geological interaction. Another crucial layer to consider is the possibility of unforeseen atmospheric or meteorological anomalies unique to Yellowstone's high-altitude, complex terrain. While general weather patterns are predictable, microclimates within the park can exhibit extreme variations. A sudden, intense, and highly localized downdraft, a microburst, could have occurred, not tearing the tent apart, but pressing it firmly into the ground. This would have anchored it securely, preventing subsequent wind damage and snow accumulation from easily disturbing its structure. Imagine a scenario where such a powerful, focused blast of air descended directly onto the tent, effectively creating a temporary, albeit violent, seal. Now consider how this applies when you're investigating events in an environment known for its dramatic weather shifts. The tent's intact state, rather than being a sign of neglect, could be evidence of this intense but brief atmospheric event. The lack of scattered belongings would also fit this hypothesis, as a sudden downward force would tend to keep items contained within the immediate vicinity of the tent. This suggests that the siblings' disappearance was tied to an extreme yet localized atmospheric phenomenon that demanded immediate shelter, leading them to secure their tent in a way that inadvertently preserved it for decades. Reflecting on this journey through the Yellowstone enigma, we find ourselves at a pivotal juncture where disparate threads of inquiry begin to coalesce into a more discernible pattern. The initial shock of the vanished siblings and the astonishing reappearance of their camp has not merely presented a puzzle, but has illuminated the profound, often counterintuitive ways in which the natural world interacts with human experience. The landscape, once perceived solely as a backdrop to tragedy, has revealed itself as an active participant, a silent architect of both preservation and obfuscation. As we stand on the precipice of resolution, the echoes of improbable survival and the subtle language of the wilderness converge, suggesting that the truth, much like the enduring tent itself, has been shaped by forces both subtle and immense. The narrative arc, woven through decades of silence and punctuated by the startling discovery, now beckons us to consider the deeper resonances of this enduring mystery. In light of the insights gleaned, the path forward is not one of simple deduction, but of understanding the intricate interplay between human vulnerability and the formidable, often inscrutable powers of the natural realm. The environmental dialogues we've explored, the subtle geological whispers, and the unexpected resilience of a simple shelter all contribute to a richer, more nuanced comprehension of how events can unfold in the wild. These converging streams of thought are not merely academic curiosities, they represent the very fabric of the mystery, now brought into sharper focus. It is as if we have been piecing together fragments of a vast mosaic, and now, as the final pieces fall into place, a more complete, albeit still haunting, picture begins to emerge, hinting at a profound truth that lies just beyond our immediate grasp. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider how the enduring questions surrounding the siblings' fate serve as a powerful metaphor for our own relationship with the unknown. The wilderness, in its vastness and its capacity to both nurture and conceal, mirrors the uncharted territories within our own understanding. The silence that once enveloped Yellowstone now seems to hum with a deeper significance, a testament to the enduring power of unanswered questions and the human spirit's unyielding quest for closure. The converging threads of evidence, each seemingly small in isolation, now form a robust tapestry, guiding us toward a conclusion that resonates with both the stark realities of nature and the indelible imprint of human presence. The silence of Yellowstone, once a vast canvas of untouched beauty, now holds a deeper resonance, forever marked by the enduring enigma of the vanished siblings. 32 years after their disappearance, the discovery of their remarkably preserved tent did not simply unearth a relic. It unearthed a profound narrative about nature's capacity to both conceal and reveal, to cradle secrets with an almost deliberate tenderness. This improbable survival, a defiance of time's relentless march, compels us to look beyond the surface, to understand that the wilderness is not merely a passive stage for human drama, but an active participant, its geological pulse and atmospheric breaths shaping destinies in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. The tent, a weathered sentinel, stands as a silent testament to a confluence of forces, perhaps a subtle geological shift, a fleeting atmospheric anomaly, or even the profound psychological retreat of its occupants, that conspired to preserve a moment, a family's final chapter, against the erosion of decades. It is a potent reminder that beneath the awe-inspiring grandeur of places like Yellowstone lie hidden mechanisms, subtle interactions that can rewrite the expected course of events, leaving behind echoes of profound human experience. This enduring mystery, far from being a mere unsolved case, offers a powerful lens through which to view our own relationship with the unknown. The park's vastness, its untamed spirit, mirrors the uncharted territories within our own consciousness. The sibling story, etched into the very fabric of this wild landscape, speaks to the fundamental human desire for answers, for closure, even when faced with the seemingly insurmountable silence of nature. The journey from their vanishing to the discovery of their camp is a testament to persistence, to the idea that truth, however buried, can, with time and careful observation, reveal itself. It encourages a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance between human presence and the primal forces of the natural world, urging us to approach such environments with a heightened sense of respect and an open mind to the unexpected. The true practice of understanding begins now, in recognizing that the most profound lessons are often found not in definitive answers, but in the persistent, thoughtful engagement with the questions themselves.